Hello, I've got a series of 6 videos for you that are going to describe the link services system and the Proxy API within Sherdo. This is pretty much aimed at developers that are doing integrations between Sherdo and other external systems, and it's a 6-parter. This first part is going to be just a basic introduction to calling external APIs and some of the common issues that we can encounter when we're trying to call those APIs from both UI components that you might be developing within Sherdo and also some of the back-end stuff like workflows and smart plans. And then we're going to look at how the link services and Proxy API within Sherdo helps us address some of those problems. Then in the future parts 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6, we're actually going to look at some demos of how the link service system and Proxy works. We're going to set a scenario up with a custom API that we've created that's got some security on it and see how some of those common issues play out, and then we'll actually use the link services and Proxy system in the UI in a custom widget and on the server in a custom workflow step, just to show how it gets rid of those common issues that you might face. So in terms of introductions, let's have a look at this slide. This is what we're talking about. So the blue box on the left, which is the Sherdo application running in the browser, which obviously calls the Sherdo services. The Sherdo services can trigger custom workflow, but the red lines are where the blue box on the left needs to talk to the blue box on the right. So that can obviously be happening from the UI with some custom widgets and things, or it can be happening from custom workflow steps to actually, I don't know, update financial information, change ratings, query your HR system, whatever it may be. Now that all sounds quite straightforward, and there are mechanics and things already in place in the standards-based world of web stuff, but there are a lot of issues that go alongside it. So starting with the UI calling your external service directly, there's a couple of things that are going to completely block you to start off with. The first thing will be the content security policy. So this is the content security policy within Sherdo itself. So Sherdo has a feature where you can configure what things the browser is allowed to talk to when Sherdo is running in the browser. It's very restrictive to start off with, so it doesn't actually allow you to talk to very much at all. So it can't load scripts, it can't load images or anything else from any other external origin unless you explicitly tell it to. And there's a whole bunch of security reasons why it does that. But when the Sherdo UI tries to call some external API, it'll get blocked by CSP, and you can go into the Sherdo feature and you can add the URL of your external API to the CSP feature under the Connect SRC section, and that will allow the Sherdo UI running in the browser to call your external API. But that's not the only thing that's going to stop you. The next thing that's going to stop you is something called CORS, cross-origin requests. So when Sherdo is running on, I don't know, myinstance.sherdo.co.uk and it wants to talk to your API at myapi.com, those are different domains. That's what they call a cross-origin request. And a cross-origin request could be any difference in the scheme, so whether it's HTTP or HTTPS, the subdomain, the domain, and the port. If those things don't all match, it's considered to be a cross-origin request, and certain policies kick in, including what actually happens is the browser will ask the external API, hey, I'm making a request from myinstance.sherdo.co.uk, am I allowed to call you? And the default should be no. Now, in order to get around that, you would need control over that external API or some interface if it's a third-party system to be able to say that Sherdo is allowed to call you. If you're in full control of that API, of course, it's quite easy to add, but some APIs just will not allow cross-origin requests at all, in which case you're a little bit scuppered. You would then be into building a facade API that sits in front of it, because server-to-server calls are not cross-origin, they're not classed as cross-origin. Cross-origin is purely for things that are running in the browser. But ultimately, you've got to have some control of that external API to allow the call to come from Sherdo. The next problem is around configuration. So the Sherdo UI needs to call the API, but typically you're going to have this deployed in multiple environments. You're going to have typically a test environment, a UAT environment, maybe a training environment, and of course a production environment. When you want to call between the UI and the API, you need to potentially call different APIs depending upon the the same API but at different URLs depending upon what the environment is. How do we represent that? Now you could bake it into the code of the UI component that you're building, your custom widget or whatever, but now you're into creating like if statements that say if Sherdo is running on whatever my production domain is, then I need to go and make the call to the external API based upon the URL for production and things like that. And it all gets quite messy, brittle and confusing. There's no central place to manage that unless of course you build something yourself within Sherdo. And then the last problem, which is probably the biggest one, is to do with token management, security, and potentially leaking that security information in the clear over the internet to people's browsers, where they can go into view source within the browser and see the security token information, potentially steal it and then use it for nefarious purposes. Whenever you call between the UI and the API, you're typically going to send some kind of security information. You're going to say, this is the thing that authenticates this call as being a valid call that's allowed to be made. Now that can range from the complicated stuff, so like an OAuth authorization code flow, which is multi-step pieces of authentication that validates the application, validates the user, issues tokens so you don't have to store usernames and password, and all of those keys and tokens need to be stored somewhere. Now, if you brought that back down to the most simplistic level for the purposes of this demo, one of the older style ways of doing authentication between two things is just to send an API key or a shared secret as a header in the HTTP request that's being made. And that's fine, but where do you put that token? Where do you put that API key? Obviously, you're building a UI component in JavaScript that's going to run in the browser. You could put that secret in your JavaScript code. But if you do that, somebody that knows a little bit about what they're doing, they can just press F12 in the browser. They can see the sources of the things that make up what they're looking at in the browser. They can read all of that client-side code, and ultimately they can discover your secret. They can then take that away and use it for something else. And as long as that API key remains valid, they'll be able to make calls to that upstream API, and that's a bad thing. So that's leaky security. But it gets a lot worse as well when we start talking about those more complex flows like OAuth and client credentials, where we have to authenticate the user, give consent for the Sherdo application to call the API on behalf of the user and all of that kind of stuff. We now have quite sensitive tokens that have been issued that absolutely should not be sent back to the UI. So we've got things like refresh tokens that would allow you to get new access tokens, and then the access token is the thing that actually allows you to call the API. If those things leak, that's never going to be a good thing. From the server side of things, with workflow, there's less issues, but there's still the same issues. So we've got issues with configuration. How do we change the URLs for that external API as we move between the environments without baking it directly into the workflow with a bunch of if statements and things like that? And again, if we're using OAuth or shared secrets and stuff, how do we manage those tokens and keys? We do have some services in Sherdo where you can call APIs to store arbitrary configuration and things like that. But again, you're going to be either passing stuff back to the UI that's visible in clear text by view source or looking at the network trace and stuff. Basically, there's no good way to securely do that token and key management stuff for you without basically exposing yourself to some kind of security issue. So how do we solve these? In Sherdo, we've got some things that will help. We have something called the link services system. So this is where you can register within Sherdo any external service with any type of authentication mechanism that we support out of the box. You can create other authentication mechanisms as well, but typically the stuff that we ship out of the box, which is everything in the OAuth standard flows list, all the way down to legacy shared secret stuff, you can register services as being available to the Sherdo application. So let's say we're registering GitHub. You would go into the Sherdo link service system, you would register GitHub, you would put in your client ID, your client secret, everything to do with the OAuth flow, and basically configure the URLs for where that link service lives, and that is now a service that is registered on the system. You can also do things like take that link service and make it available for individual users to link their individual accounts. So rather than just linking Sherdo to the external API with a single account, you can allow individual users to link their own personal accounts. So whenever Sherdo is making that call up to that external API, it's doing it as a particular user. And that's all well and good. That kind of solves a few things around the configuration management, because as you move between environments, you just change the URLs of the link service definition that you've got, which is all good. But it also has all of the plumbing necessary to do all of the token and key management and keep all of that within the Sherdo application itself without having to send it anywhere else, especially out to the UI. So the link services system, once you've defined one of those services and you've linked an account, it will look after the management of the tokens that are necessary to call the service. So to go alongside that, we've then got the Proxy API. So having the link service itself is all good. We've got some configuration and things that we can set up. Theoretically, the Sherdo UI could talk to that to get its configuration now, but you've still got the issue of, well, how do I actually make a request without falling foul of the content security policy, the cross-origin request, and without leaking any of my security information? And that's where the Proxy API comes in. So the Proxy API is an API within Sherdo itself that can be called from workflow, from the UI, from anything that can talk to any of these link services that you've set up. And the way that it works is you make a request to the Proxy API with the URL of API proxy, and then the rest of that URL is the URL that you want to call on the external service. Sorry, one other component of the URL is also the name of the link service. So you can't use the Proxy API just to arbitrarily call any old service. It has to be one of the link services that's been defined, and the link service has to be set up to enable proxy. So the Sherdo proxy itself is sat there quite benign. It will not do anything. You can post as many requests as you want to it and try and tell it to go and talk to Google or Office 365 or whatever. It will not do so unless, number one, that request is authenticated in the first place using the usual Sherdo authentication mechanisms, but also the link service needs to exist. It needs to be valid. It needs to be enabled for proxy. So what that allows us to do is the Sherdo UI, instead of calling the service directly, it will call the Proxy API. Call the Proxy API, telling it which service it wants to call, what the URL is, what the parameters are that it needs to pass across, what the verb needs to be, whether it's get, put, post, delete, or any of the other verbs. And the proxy will then do all of the Sherdo link services plumbing, which is sort out the tokens and keys, will read the configuration, and then it will call what has been configured, the actual external API URL, to get a response and then forward it back to the UI or back to the workflow. So it effectively gets rid of the need for the content security policy to be changed, because ultimately you're still calling the Sherdo APIs from the UI. It's not a cross-origin request anymore because you're calling the Sherdo API, which is where the UI comes from. So there's no cross-origin request necessary. The configuration is all being stored against the link service itself and can be changed as you deploy these things between environments. All the tokens and keys are being managed within the link service system itself, so none of that security information is being leaked. That's pretty much it for the first video. In the next one, we're going to actually have a look at this stuff, and we're going to configure some stuff and look at setting it up against GitHub. We'll poke the proxy to get some information from GitHub directly in the browser and just watch how all of this stuff hangs together before we move into a more advanced scenario. That's it for this one though. Thanks.